Good day. Over the last few days, there has been a major show of force by China over Taiwan, with the Chinese Air Force deploying first 38 and then 39 military aircraft in Taiwan's air defense observation zone on 2 consecutive days. This has come alongside of further broadcasts of Chinese intent over Taiwan, some of these directed specifically at the European Union. I'm going to come to those in a moment, but let's first of all deal with the exercises themselves and consider what exactly has happened. And first of all, we have an account of the exercises, as I said, on 2 consecutive days from Global Times, the unofficial voice of China's Communist Party. It is, as I said, a newspaper owned by the People's Daily, which is the Chinese official Communist Party newspaper, though Global Times significantly publishes in English. And what Global Times says about these military deployments, its factual article, if you prefer, says the following. Only 1 day after the Chinese People's Liberation Army dispatched 38 warplanes near the island of Taiwan for exercise on National Day, breaking the previous record set in June, it again refreshed this record on Saturday, sending a total of 39 aircraft of different types near the island during both day and night, according to defense authorities on the island. The 20 PLA aircraft, namely 14 J-16 fighter jets, 4 Sukhoi 30 fighter jets, and 2 Y-8 anti-submarine warfare aircraft, entered the island of Taiwan's self-proclaimed Southwest Air Defense Identification Zone on Saturday. On early Sunday, Taiwan's defense authorities published a separate press release saying that at Saturday night, 19 additional PLA aircraft, namely 12 J-16 fighter jets, 6 Sukhoi 30 fighter jets, and a KJ-500 early warning aircraft, entered the island of Taiwan's self-proclaimed Southwest Air Defense Identification Zone. Both exercises, featuring a total of 39 PLA aircraft, were held in areas between the island of Taiwan and the Dongsha Islands in the South China Sea. This means that the previous record of 38 PLA warplanes taking part in drills near the island of Taiwan in a day was eclipsed only 1 day after it was set. Chinese mainland military expert Song Zhongping told Global Times on Saturday that the increasing scale of exercises is normal and routine, since the PLA needs more deployment to deter armed forces on the island and foreign interference from other nations. Nighttime drills are important because combat could take place at any time. The record-breaking PLA exercises over the past 2 days could also be related to recent movements of U.S. aircraft carriers. Both the USS Ronald Reagan and USS Carl Vinson aircraft carriers were sailing in waters near the island of Taiwan on September 27th, the news website of the US Naval Institute reported on that day. Now, I get to say straight away that I have absolutely no doubt that this show of force is indeed related to the movements of these US aircraft carriers. Quite possibly, the US military, when they deployed these aircraft carriers, was not making any particular demonstration against China and did not see these deployments as having any special significance. The Chinese, however, may have seen them differently, and I am fairly sure that this major show of force by the Chinese Air Force in the areas around Taiwan was intended to reinforce the message to the US that in the event that the US were to try to make forward deployments of US Navy carriers near Taiwan or in the South China Sea, the Chinese Air Force is in a position to comprehensively outmatch them. And I think that is what these deployments were primarily about. But they have provided the Chinese with further opportunities to make all sorts of claims about them and to ram home their opinions about Taiwan and to give warnings to the European Union. And I'm going to now deal with an actual editorial that Global Times has published on this very topic, which is timed exactly with that factual article by Global Times, which I have just read out. And this editorial perhaps also repays reading, and it says the following. Just one day after the Chinese People's Liberation Army sent 38 warplanes for exercises near the island of Taiwan on Friday, which also marks China's National Day, the PLA dispatched 39 aircraft over the island's self-proclaimed Southwest Air Defense Identification Zone. This has consecutively broken the previous record of the scale of exercises in this area. The Democratic Progressive Party authorities in the island were shocked, while public opinion in the US and the West continues to speculate on the move. The PLA has done an excellent job! Exclamation mark. This can be seen as a form of the National Day military parade in the Taiwan Straits, which used to be held on Tiananmen Square in Beijing. It is a clear and unmistakable declaration of China's sovereignty over the island. This is apt given the 72nd anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, greatly encouraging people nationwide, and highlighted and emphasized to a new height the special significance of National Day. The 38 and 39 warplanes dispatched in 2 consecutive days to the exercise during the day and night near the island of Taiwan were not a guard of honor. They are fighting forces aimed at actual combat. The increase in the number of aircraft showed the PLA Air Force's operational capabilities. The warplanes that gathered over the straits were possibly dispatched from different airports, showing the strong ability of the PLA to form a wartime attack. According to statistics from Taiwan Island, the PLA has sent warplanes into the island's airspace. The word airspace is in inverted commas, in 198 days so far this year. Such a number reflects that the PLA has carried out wide-ranged and profound operations to familiarize itself with battlefield conditions, with a large number of PLA Air Force units having experience flying close to the island. Once the order to attack is given, the PLA's pilots will fight as experienced veterans. The DPP authorities have violated the 1992 consensus and are recklessly in pursuit of secessionism. They are willing to act as an anti-China chess piece in conjunction with the US, and thus has pushed the Straits situation to the brink. They have constantly hyped up claims that they are at the forefront of the so-called democratic world to resist authoritarian rule. They have thus turned themselves into a bloc that the Chinese mainland must get rid of strategically, and an evil force the mainland must crush. The PLA is forming a siege of Taiwan with a show of strength as it did in Beijing in 1949. There is no doubt about the future of the situation across the Taiwan Straits. The initiative of when and how to solve the Taiwan question is firmly in the hands of the Chinese mainland. Now, this is fighting talk, and as I said, it comes from a newspaper, and admittedly, English language newspaper, which is very closely connected, as I said previously, to the Chinese Communist Party, and which therefore must reflect, at least to some extent, opinions within the Chinese government. Notice that there is never any attempt by the Chinese authorities to rein in Global Times or to say or imply that it does not speak for China on these kind of matters. So this is fighting talk, and I would add that it does put in some context an article I've just been reading on the Moon of Alabama website, which goes out of its way to try to play down the significance of these movements. It suggests that Western reporting of these Chinese military deployments so close to Taiwan is somehow overblown and makes the deployments seem more threatening than they actually were, and it tries to draw a distinction between Taiwan's air defense zone and the actual reality, which is that this was not supposedly an air defense zone, but rather an air defense identification zone, making these deployments seem somewhat less, shall we say, threatening than the Western media agencies are reporting. I have to say that though I am somebody who has huge respect for the Moon of Alabama and its analytical abilities, I think on this occasion it is being a bit misplaced. I accept that there is probably some distinction between the air defense identification zone and the air defense zone, but I would point out that it's only a short time ago, in fact about a week ago, that Global Times was talking about sending Chinese military aircraft overflying Taiwan itself, that is to say, overflying, going right to the heart of Taiwan's air defense zone, however that is defined. And we see that the Global Times is now talking about a siege of Taiwan comparable to the siege the People's Liberation Army subjected Beijing to in 1949, when it was still controlled by the former Kuomintang government of China. And it also goes into immense detail and great discussion about the extent to which this is preparation for a future attack on Taiwan, with the Chinese military thereby gaining experience of operating close to Taiwan, monitoring its air defense system, and in fact training its pilots, making them in effect veterans in preparation for an attack. And Global Times pretty much says that that attack someday is coming. So, as I said, fighting talk, and yes, this might not have been Taiwan's air defense zone, but the Chinese have said that they're going to penetrate that eventually, and perhaps before very long. And in any event, this falls only just short of penetrating that air defense zone. And these very strong exercises, these very effective exercises that the Chinese are themselves talking up, not just the Western media, they come in conjunction with a very powerful, unsigned article in Global Times. It's not an editorial, but it's clearly written with the authority of the entire newspaper, which criticizes the Taiwan policy as it's evolving of the European Union. And what it says is, EU warned not to play with fire on Taiwan question. Now, who is warning the EU? Global Times or China? Well, that is unambiguous. And as I've said many times in many programs, Global Times is in effect the voice of China, or at least should be treated as if it is. And anyway, to continue, and again, the article perhaps repays full quotation. What it says is the following. After Lithuania sought to develop relations with the island of Taiwan in a way that violates the One China principle, there have been increasing voices in the EU placing an unusual and dangerous focus on developing ties with the island. European leaders would be well advised to avoid crossing China's red line on the Taiwan question. Well, that seems to answer the question about where the warning is coming from. It's not just Global Times, it's also China itself, because we read that the EU is coming close to crossing China's red line on the Taiwan question. Anyway, to continue with the article, the European Economic and Trade Office in the island, that's to say in Taiwan, said in a new report that their relations continue to thrive despite the global pandemic and regional situation. In particular, Filip Grzegojewski, head of the EETO, claimed that Taiwan plays a fundamental role in our Indo-Pacific vision, according to a press release. The EETO releases a report each year, and its past reports usually focus on areas such as economic and trade cooperation, education, and cultural exchanges. But this year's report views the island as an important piece in the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, which apparently is based on strong political considerations rather than economic cooperation. The EETO report came at a time when the EU is making provocative moves regarding the Taiwan question, despite fierce objections from the Chinese mainland. On September 1st, the European Parliament's Committee on Foreign Affairs adopted a report not only calling for elevating political relations, but also including the island in its Indo-Pacific strategy and advocating for the island's full participation as an observer in international bodies. On September 16th, the EU issued a formal strategy to boost its presence in the Indo-Pacific, pledging to seek a trade deal with the island. If the EU simply wants to develop normal economic and trade relations with the Taiwan island, its unusual emphasis on the latter's role in its Indo-Pacific strategy should be viewed with suspicion. Some European politicians may think that playing the Taiwan card will draw more attention and could help pressure the mainland to make more concessions. But confusing the right and the wrong on China's bottom line is a dead end. The Chinese mainland's position on the Taiwan question remains clear and resolute. All exchanges with the island must be handled in strict accordance with the One China principle. They cannot exceed the scope of normal non-official cooperation and exchange. The Chinese mainland was the EU's largest trading partner in 2020. With such a massive bilateral trade, it is hard to imagine that the EU will really choose to distance itself from the mainland by violating the One China principle. If the EU wants to safeguard such a mutually beneficial trade relationship with China, it is advised to pay respect to China's sovereignty, security, and development interests. Now, the background to all of this is that some of the allies of the United States, especially some of the East European allies, have been within the EU, East European countries, have been pushing the EU towards a more confrontational policy with China, which in some respects involves making openings towards Taiwan. Not every country in the EU supports this approach, and that's putting it mildly, but some have done so. And within the militantly anti-Russian and pro-US European Parliament, we see all kinds of strange reports floating around, mainly sponsored by East European politicians, which appear to be taking a stronger line in supporting Taiwan and ultimately, of course, the US against China. I would add that the same EU politicians are also in the process of sponsoring all sorts of anti-Russian resolutions, including a particularly bizarre one that was recently published by the European Parliament which in effect called for open interference in Russian internal affairs and called on the EU to refuse to recognize the recent Russian parliamentary elections. So what the Chinese are telling the EU is that if the EU persists with this, it is playing with fire. Ultimately, as far as China is concerned, even though obviously China benefits from its trade with the EU and wants to maintain its trade with the EU, Taiwan is for China an existential issue, and if it comes to it, China is prepared to sacrifice its trade relations with the EU in order to pursue its strategy, its one China policy. And the EU will, of course, suffer severe economic consequences if trade with China is disrupted. China will also suffer severe economic consequences if its trade with the EU is disrupted. But this is an existential issue for China. It is not an existential issue for the EU. China is prepared to make that sacrifice. It's debatable whether the EU is. So, we've seen a whole succession of very strong steps taken by the Chinese over the last few days. Military deployments, aircraft deployments around Taiwan, testing the island's defences, with Global Times telling us quite openly that these deployments are the precursor for a future attack on the island and are basically preparing the Chinese Air Force to launch such an attack. Implicit warnings to the United States that its naval deployments, its deployments of aircraft carriers close to the island of Taiwan are or will be matched by comparable or even greater military deployments by the Chinese themselves. And with the Chinese saying quite openly that the recent deployments of their fighter jets close to Taiwan is partly in response to those US Navy carrier deployments in the seas around Taiwan. And lastly, a very clear warning to the European Union that if it does take steps towards upgrading political relations with Taiwan in place of economic relations with Taiwan, then it risks a major showdown with China, which could result in a collapse in the trading relationship between China and the European Union, which would have, by the way, have a major impact on parts of the European economy, especially, my guess, is on Germany's. Now, should we take all this seriously? Are the Chinese really planning a military attack on Taiwan? Is that really their agenda? And would they really, in fact, jeopardize their highly profitable relationship with the EU in order to emphasize, to preserve their one China policy? Well, I'm going to make a general observation here, which is which flows from much of the discussion I've had about in the past about Russian relations with Ukraine and the Russian actions in Crimea and Russian support for the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and also about President Erdogan of Turkey's recent moves to distance himself from the United States and to achieve ever greater proximity to the Eurasian powers, to China and Russia. And that is that I think that in every single case, the Western powers, the United States and the European Union, underestimate how important these issues, Crimea, eastern Ukraine, the Kurds in northeast Syria, Taiwan are for the other side. They always, I think, assume that ultimately the other side, be it the Russians or the Turks or the Chinese, are bluffing. When the Russians and the Chinese and the Turks all say that Ukraine, Crimea, Kurdistan, and Taiwan are existential issues for them, and that they have red lines in connection with them, I think that the US and the EU always go away and say to themselves, well, ultimately, the Russians, the Turks, the Chinese are not being serious about this. They don't really mean what they say. They're not going to accept the economic sacrifices that putting their words into action would involve. They're just bluffing. We can call their bluff because ultimately they will not want to jeopardize their relationship with us. Now, in 2014, I have no doubt at all that that is what the European Union and the United States imagined would be the case over Ukraine. And they turned out to be completely and utterly wrong. And the result is that they have now found themselves in a prolonged quagmire in Ukraine, a situation where they're committing themselves to supporting a country that is essentially bankrupt and which is going economically to pieces, and where they've maneuvered themselves into a sanctions policy against Russia, which they would confident would cause Russia to buckle, but which instead is creating for them increasing costs, including economic costs, but also geopolitical costs, as Russia has responded by strengthening its relations with Beijing. So that was one major miscalculation. And I think the US and the Europeans are making an identical miscalculation about Turkey and about the Kurds in northeast Syria. I think the United States just doesn't really believe, and nor do the Europeans, by the way, that when Erdogan says that for Turkey the issue of the Kurds in northern Syria is an existential one, I just don't think that they really take him seriously. They don't believe that Erdogan, or indeed Turkey, really would put their relationship with the West in jeopardy. After all, as several people pointed out on the thread of my last video, Turkey's economy is at the moment in an extremely fragile state. The living standards in Turkey have been falling. US sanctions on Turkey, if they were ever imposed, would be crushing. And Turkey arguably can't afford all these massive arms purchases that Erdogan is talking about or talking to with the Russians. But of course, this always assumes that Erdogan and the Turks would not be, the Turkish people, would not be prepared to bear the heavy economic costs that people are threatening them with in the event that they persist with their existing policies. And of course, one can't be certain one way or the other until this thing has been tested. But I'm going to make my own guess here, which is that for Turkey, for any Turkish government, relations with the Kurds is such an existential issue that my own opinion is that where Erdogan is concerned, he is being entirely serious in what he's saying about the Kurds, and I think most Turks feel much as he does. In other words, they would be prepared to accept significant economic sacrifices in order, as they see it, to preserve Turkey's security and its territorial integrity. And if that means a break with the Western powers, an economic pressure on Turkey, and perhaps even an economic crisis there, they would accept it. And of course, the fact that they might hope that in the event of such a crisis, the Eurasian powers, Russia and China, might come to their rescue, well, that would probably only encourage them further to take that line. I speak with some knowledge of this. After all, Turkey is very much part of my familial neighbourhood. I am a Greek. I've been to Turkey. I've had interchanges with many Turkish people. I think I know what I'm talking about on this issue. I would add that the West made the same or a similar miscalculation about Iran. It too imagined that all sorts of crushing economic sanctions that had been imposed on Iran would force Iran ultimately to change its Middle East policies. And we've seen that the Iranians have been prepared to accept the cost and price of all of these sanctions and of all of this economic pressure, because as far as they are concerned, Iran's foreign policies in the Middle East are an existential issue. They provide Iran with an extra layer of security which Iranians feel they need after the prolonged and disastrous war they had to wage against Saddam Hussein and in the 1980s. And we come back to Syria also, another country which has defied the West and baffled the West by its resistance to pressure and sanctions. It's often forgotten that one of the major reasons for all the pressure on Syria is that the Syrians, for all sorts of reasons, insisted on preserving their alliance with Iran. And there were all sorts of attempts to persuade the Syrian government, President Assad's government, that he should end that alliance with Iran. And if he did end that alliance, that all this pressure or many of these problems that he was facing would end. And again, Assad refused to do it because he and lots of other people in Syria saw that alliance with Iran as an existential issue for Syria, one absolutely vital in order to preserve Syria's independence and its freedom of maneuver. So, and ultimately, I would add its security. And again, a critical mass of people in Syria has ended up supporting Assad in that position. And I think with China, it is the same. I think the Chinese, when they talk about Taiwan as an existential issue for them, when they make it absolutely clear that they are not prepared to tolerate any move by Taiwan towards independence, that they're prepared to fight to make sure that Taiwan does not become independent of China, in name as well as in fact, that they are prepared to go to war with the US Navy and with the US military over this issue, and that they're prepared to take fundamental economic decisions with respect to Europe. I believe that the Chinese are being completely serious about this. As I have also discussed in a program I recently did, which is exclusive to locals, I believe that many of the changes that have happened in Chinese economic policy over the last year, and which have attracted so much interest and so much attention, are precisely policy changes made by China in anticipation of a crisis with the West. So I think that the Chinese intentionally pricked the bubble of their property market and took all sorts of other steps with respect to the general orientation of their economy in order to prepare that economy and Chinese society for a potential siege by the West in the event that the situation in Taiwan becomes critical, or in the event that there is a major clash in the South China Sea. So I think that the Chinese are being deadly serious about all of these issues, and that those who think that the Chinese are bluffing are profoundly and perhaps even catastrophically wrong. I would add that if we are bluffing against China, if we imagine that by making all sorts of threats against China and by saying to the Chinese that if they do attack Taiwan, we will actually step in to defend Taiwan in some way, If we are saying all of this without meaning to, if we are in effect bluffing the Chinese, then we are even more misguided. Because as I have repeatedly said, if the first rule of war is don't march on Moscow, the first rule of diplomacy is don't bluff Beijing. If you bluff Beijing, if you bluff China, your bluff is always called. Now, I say all of this. It seems to me that the situation is deteriorating. And in fact, it's interesting that the Chinese have made all of these moves now. Because, first of all, undoubtedly, as I have said, partly this is a response to the movement of these US aircraft carriers. I'm far from sure, as I said, that when the United States sent those aircraft carriers close to Taiwan, it had any expectation or realization that it was taking a step or an action which might provoke the kind of Chinese response which we have seen. But I can't help but think that these Chinese moves might also have been precipitated by certain other things which have happened over the last few weeks. Firstly, there was that disastrous conversation between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, which took place a few weeks ago, in which Joe Biden talked to Xi Jinping about the importance of trying to stabilize the situation in the Pacific, and it reassured Xi Jinping that the United States remains committed to its one China policy, but in which on the very following day, reports appeared in the Western media, in the United States media, confirming that the United States government or agencies of the United States government were in talks with Taiwan about upgrading the status of Taiwan's representation office in Washington. So I'm sure that that played part of a role in this action. And I am sure that another thing that played an even bigger role was those extremely unhappy talks that appear to have taken place between the Chinese and US militaries, which I also discussed recently in a video. I have pointed out when I discussed those talks and the communiques and information that both the United States and the Chinese have published about those talks. It seems that those talks ended in total deadlock and perhaps some argument, and that the work's frank and open exchange of views, which we saw in the US readout, came very close to signifying that there was actually a row. It looks as if the Chinese, coming away from this difficult meeting with the United States military, decided that the time had come for them to make a show of force along the Taiwan Straits, and seeing also these American carriers being deployed there, they sent their air force probing Taiwan's defenses in this way, demonstrating a massive show of force directed against the United States. So I think the Chinese are being deadly serious about this. I think that they're acting very negatively to these signals that the United States is making to them. I think that they see these approaches that Biden and the administration is trying to make towards China as ultimately duplicitous, trying to pursue a kind of a la carte policy towards China, where the United States gets Chinese help on topics of interest to the United States, but shows no willingness to make concessions to China on issues that are important to China. And I think the Chinese have emphasized through these military deployments, through this show of force, which has just happened, that that is not acceptable, that that's not a policy approach which is going to work, and that persisting with it is going to result ultimately in a major showdown and a major military showdown in the Taiwan Straits and around Taiwan itself, and that any American warships that are foolish enough to involve themselves in that showdown place themselves at grave risk. And I think, again, the Chinese are signalling clearly to the European Union once more that they're in deadly earnest about this, and that when it comes to Taiwan, if the European Union wants to play games in the Taiwan Straits, then it is going to get very badly burnt, and the jobs and businesses in Germany and in Europe are at serious risk if they do so, and that if European consumers are concerned about the disruption of supply chains at the moment and the higher prices that come from that, then they need to buckle down and expect far worse if European policy continues along the lines that it is doing. As I said, I believe that all of this is in deadly earnest and entirely serious, and I think that, again, the experience shows that the Western powers have great difficulty understanding this. Well, will they understand it? Will they finally come to acknowledge that when the Chinese talk about Taiwan in this way, they mean what they are saying? I don't know. I think the inability of people in Washington and Brussels and London, and to some extent in Berlin and Paris also, and certainly in some of the East European capitals, to understand how serious the situation is potentially becoming. I'm afraid their inability to understand this simply cannot be underestimated. And I'm afraid that we could very well find ourselves in a situation where we drift into a crisis with the Chinese, which more careful manoeuvring might have avoided. But one must live in hope that at the same time as there are people in the West who are making these mistakes, there are other people who will see these things more wisely and more carefully. Well, there we are. We shall see what happens over the next few weeks and months and probably years. There is still time and space to maneuver around this problem, but that depends on acting wisely and carefully and making the necessary adjustments and making the necessary policy decisions, and we'll see whether that wisdom exists. Thank you for joining me today. Apologies for the barking of the dog. I hope you got all of the points that I wanted to make clearly. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs, both on this channel and our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please remember to check us out on our other platforms, above all Locals, where we now publish lots of exclusive content, and where you will also find a community publishes content of its own, and where you can, by the way, also participate fully in our live streams. And also, please remember to check us out on our various other platforms. We're not only on Locals, but we're also on BitChute, Library, Rumble, and Odyssey as well. And if you want to support us, you can support us via our shop, where you can buy all sorts of amazing things like our famous magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Lastly, if you've enjoyed this video or liked this video, please remember to tick the like button, and please also remember to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today on this program. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.